reflection, and I've entitled it How to Make It Work for You, especially for developing your practice, be that in education or in fact in your workplace or indeed in a dietetic setting. So let's get on with it and see how we can learn more about reflection and its contribution to you and your lifelong learning. It has been funded with support from the EU. Oh, it's gone again. There we go. And so this reflects just our views rather than the Commission. So this unit is actually a series for dietitians, students and teachers, and you can find the unit with my voiceover at the Diet's website. It's part of the e-learning series, so please go and have a look and provide any feedback to us through that route. You'll see the address there, so that's our network manager, that's Judith, who's actually part of our session today. So the aims for today is to understand how learning takes place, and when we've done that we can think of ways of helping to make sure that the process is really thorough and that we do learn, and secondly to introduce the process of reflection for us, our lifelong learning. Now, in addition to this presentation with the voiceover, we also have a podcast also on the website, and if you want to use this either for yourself or for your students, then that's also possible. So please also listen to the podcast. We're not going to do that today, but all of these things help us to review and revise and to think again about lifelong learning and how reflection fits into that. What is learning? Well, let's think first of all, learning is producing change. Change in knowledge, what we know now we probably didn't know about yesterday. Change in skills, what we can do now that maybe we couldn't do a few years ago. A change in understanding and a change in attitudes. So learning can just be summarized as producing a change. But everyone learns differently. And this is an interesting quote about students. Students obviously learn different things from one and the same text. So we know that. You can all read the same text, but your knowledge, what you've taken from that text, is quite different. So your knowledge about various scientific principles or methods or ideas varies as regards what is learned, instead of just differing as regards how much is learned. So we read different things into different texts. What is different from how much? We could all memorize our multiplication tables, but of course what we do with that information can be very different from one person to another. And I always use this example for students in saying everyone can sit in the same classroom, but everyone doesn't all get 90% on their tests. So let's think, what is reflection? This is a definition of reflection by Boud, and it's a generic term used for those intellectual and affective, in other words, those activities in which you engage to explore your experiences. In other words, your learning, in order to lead to a new understanding and appreciation. And as we go through the slides, we'll come back again and again to what we mean by in order to learn new, and to have new understandings and new appreciations of a particular topic. We all learn something new from our experiences every day, and this is called experiential learning, learning from experience. It isn't necessarily necessary to sit in a classroom to learn. For example, if you want to learn a skill, like driving a car, then going out and practicing each time you learn something new about the skill of driving. So we learn something from our experiences, and it's called experiential learning. Well, why bother? Let's stop. Let's stop and think. Why bother? Well, it's important for us as professionals and those training to be professionals to think about what we have learnt, to reflect on what we have learnt, how we've changed, if you like. Just experiencing an event is not enough. Without taking the time to think about what we've experienced and consider what we're going to do with what we've experienced, we may in fact repeat our actions in future situations and get it wrong again. In other words, if we don't stop and think, did that go well? Was there some way I could do it better? We might just go on repeating the same mistakes again. So for a professional and those in training, we need to stop and we need to think, what I've just experienced, what have I learnt from that? Reviewing the experience and thinking about what we've learnt means that we are likely to improve and we're unlikely to repeat our mistakes again. So we need continually to learn from our experiences, and sometimes stopping to think is difficult because we're all busy and we want to hurry on. But it's important to stop and think. Well, if learning is producing change, then how do we know we've changed? How do we know that we've changed our knowledge, in our skills, understanding, and our attitude? Well, we've just reviewed through experience and thinking about that experience or reflecting upon that experience. Through experience, through thinking, and both of those are the process of reflection. When we go out into the world, so to speak, when we leave our university, when we actually leave the course, when we leave this session, we go into what I've called the professional classroom. So when we leave the formal education, we go out into the world, and this is the place now where we learn. And of course, the more we learn, hopefully, the more proficient we become. But how do we make that really effective? How do we get more learning to actually advance our practice? How do we do that in a systematic way? Where is our teacher? Where do we get the information? The teacher is no longer there, shouting instructions to us. We have to actually be our own teacher. This is a very interesting quote from a paper called Educating Tomorrow's Doctors, and it was put into the front of a paper about a new undergraduate curriculum for doctors in Glasgow. And this is what the quote says. If we observe the process which we call instruction or teaching, we see that there are two parties joined together. There's the learner and the teacher. Now the object of both of them is the same, but of course their relation to the work to be done is different. The essential part, that is the assimilation of knowledge by the mind, can be performed by no one but the learner. And it follows, therefore, that he is in fact his own teacher, and that learning is self-teaching. This is not an easy concept for our students and for many of us who rely on teachers, people external to ourselves, to impart information, to teach us new skills, to actually help us grow in our knowledge. But actually, you realize that nobody's following you around, packing information into your head. So in fact, you must be your own teacher. So we are our own teachers. We teach ourselves. Therefore, what does the teacher do? The teacher's part then in the process of instruction is that of a guide, a director, or a superintendent of the operations by which the pupil teaches himself. So if you take today, I'm going to introduce some information which you may already know. I may introduce it in a way that you haven't heard before, and it may make connections, and it may make you think, now that's an interesting way of presenting something, or that's an interesting way of expressing an idea. And these ideas, these thoughts you have, are then stored, and you may repeat them, you may build on them, you may make connections with them. I can't do that for you. You're doing that for yourself. You are therefore your own teacher. Now, what is absolutely amazing is that that particular quote was written in 1883 by somebody called Joseph Payne, which is quite amazing. So if we're a guide, a director, or a superintendent, it means that as a teacher we set up the learning situation. And we can guide students, but we cannot teach them to learn. Sorry, we can teach them to learn, but we can't actually make sure that they do learn. I wanted to show you this picture by Dewey. Dewey was an educational psychologist, and this is his model for experiential learning. If we start at the top, on the left-hand side of that spiral, you'll see the word impulse. What Dewey said was that when we're learning, we first of all receive an impulse. We receive something from externally. We receive perhaps a sound, or we receive some words. We receive something. We have an impulse. We then think about that impulse. We observe it, and we relate it to knowledge that we have already stored, if you like, in our brain. Have we heard that sound before? Do we recognize it? Do we know what that word means? And we make sense of what we've just heard or seen in that knowledge. From there, we make a judgment. We make a connection, and we think, aha, I have heard that before, but this time it sounds a little bit different, or I recognize that word, but it's being used in a different way. And that leads us on to the next time when we have a new impulse. And when that new impulse comes in, we again think about it, but this time we actually have a little bit more knowledge. We've gained some knowledge from the first time, so that when we make the judgment, we can interpret it a little bit more fully, perhaps, than we had the first time. And so on, and so on, and so on. It is a spiral. And I think this is quite helpful, And I want to use an analogy here that I've often used with students. When a student dietitian first goes in to observe a qualified dietitian, they will often say, "Wow, how did you know that?" Or, "My goodness me, how did you know to do this?" Well, the reason is, of course, because the qualified dietitian has been round this circle, this spiral, many, many times, and their knowledge has been built up from K1 to, let's say, K96 or K149. It is quite amazing. Here's another little thought for you. If I hold out my hand, and on my hand I have a muffin which actually has a calorific value of 800 calories, what would you think about that? Would you think, "Grief, a wonderful muffin to be eating"? Or would you think, "Grief, I'm not going to have that muffin"? What would you think? Do you want to just write a couple of short comments? Would you think 800 calorie muffin? No problem. Would you think 800 calorie muffin? Well, that's quite a lot. What would you think? Just write down quite a lot or not a problem. What would you think? Does anybody like to make a comment? Thank you, Anna Isabel. Quite a lot. After sitting down to so much, okay, well, I prefer not to eat it, okay, but sometimes it doesn't matter. Okay, how did you know that? How did you know that it was quite a lot? How did you know that you would prefer not to? And the answer is, of course, because you have been socialized, you understand about calories in food. If you went home and you spoke perhaps to your husband or your partner or your grandmother, and you said, this muffin has 800 calories in it, they'd look at you and say, "So? That doesn't sound like a big deal. 800 calories? Oh, not a problem." And the reason is they haven't been round this spiral as many times as you have, and they have no knowledge bank so that when the impulse arrives, "Would you like this muffin?" they look at it and they think, "Well, I like muffins." And when you say it's 800 calories, they have no knowledge to interpret that information. So their judgment is, "Okay, I'll eat it." So we go round this circle over and over again, building up our knowledge, building up our interpretation. And it happens with skills, and it happens with attitudes. We receive information, we think about it, we interpret it, and then we do something with it. And we continually build and strengthen and grow. In professional practice, there is a high, hard ground where practitioners make effective use of research-based theory and techniques. And there is a swampy lowland where situations are confusing messes, incapable of technical solutions. When you're in the university, we teach evidence-based practice. When you're reading papers, when you're thinking about finding answers, you consult books, you consult papers, you listen to presentations. And these are often very clear-cut. It's like looking at a mountain where it's very clear, it's very hard, it's very comforting. The problem is that when we get out into the world, it's less clear, it's less comforting, and it's quite confusing. So professionals try and think about how to solve solutions in that swampy area rather than always have very clear-cut answers. And this is professional practice. This is going round that circle and drawing on knowledge from our clear-cut, clear answers in papers, through research, the high, hard ground. But the problem is that life is not like that, and we have to interpret that information into the situations where most of us find ourselves, where there are no research papers to give us the answers. Here's a picture of a swamp, and I think sometimes we get into a situation, our students get into a situation where all their learning, all the information from their research evidence doesn't help them to find their way through this tangle of mess. So the difficulty is that for the professional, the problems of the high ground, the clear research answers, which are of technical interest, are often very unimportant to the people that we're working with, to the students, to our colleagues. While in the swamp, in that area which is confusing, are the problems of our greatest human concern. Now, as a practitioner, we have a choice. We can either stay on the high ground, where we can practice absolutely according to the book, but where we are constrained, because often if we're practicing because only we can find a paper to use to give us the answer, these are not really very interesting to our clients, because every one of them is different. So we have to descend into the swamp where we engage with the most important and challenging problems, but we then forsake technical rigor. And that's what we find ourselves doing most of the time as healthcare practitioners. There are no books to help us. We have to figure it out for ourselves. We have to go round that spiral, if you like, on many occasions to try and work out exactly what the answer is, building up on our knowledge. We leave our books behind us when we go into our professional classroom. Bye-bye, Rays. So where do we find ourselves every day? Do we find ourselves where there are clear and researchable answers? Or do we find ourselves in a swamp where every case is different and there are no clear answers? And when we leave and we go out into the world, we go out into a world where there are things such as departmental cultures, where there is routine work and protocols, where there is politics. You can't look politics up in a book. And so you have to rely on your own experiential learning. So, only we can learn how to teach ourselves. We operate in a swampy lowland where there's no book to tell us how to do it. But there is a professional classroom where we can learn if we choose to teach ourselves. And we learn through experience, through reading, through discussion, and through observation. How do we teach ourselves? Why should we bother? And is there a method we can adopt? Well, going back to Dewey's model, yes, there is. Because we are having these impulses and trying to make sense through observation of these impulses to build up our knowledge, to make a judgment on the next time that impulse arrives, so that we can interpret it and continue to build and develop our knowledge, our understanding and our learning. And it's called reflection. So reflective learning is deliberately thinking about something, an action or an experience, with a view to its improvement. Deliberately thinking about it with a view to its improvement. Deliberately, so that we can change, going round this circle so that we learn and teach ourselves through reflection. Remember, experience is not sufficient because it could be a lifetime of the same experience. So the experience needs to be interpreted and integrated to produce new or expanded knowledge and understanding, to provide growth, to help us learn how to cope in that swampy lowland where there are no books and no scientific papers to help us. And of course it is a skill for survival and growth because it helps us to understand the world about us and how we cope with the politics. Did it work well this time, the way I did the politics? Did it not work well? Why didn't it work well? How did that meeting go? Did I make my point? Did I not make my point? How could it have been different? This is all reflection on experience. So, how do we know that we've changed? Through experience, thinking about that experience, and doing a process called reflection. How about the podcast? Do not forget to have a listen. Reflection is a process then of reviewing an experience in order to describe, analyze, evaluate, and inform us about learning, just like you would any piece of research. Review, analyze, evaluate, so that it is a way of learning and a way of survival once you're in your professional classroom. It's really important to write it down, to develop the habit of writing down your experiences, to review and reflect, analyze and evaluate. It means that you write down something which you feel has been significant. Sometimes it's something which made you feel really uncomfortable, and sometimes it's something which really went well. It forces time to be taken for reflection. It forces you to learn to organize and clarify your thoughts. Writing it down helps. It causes you to focus your attention on things that you may have missed, you may not have thought of at first. It encourages you to write an explanation. Why did I feel like that? What was it? It captures ideas for later. If you analyze it and say, why did I feel like that? Then you can either take action not to do that again, or you can take action to think, I'm feeling like that again in another situation. I need to do something about it. It captures ideas for later. It provides you with a feedback system. And it slows down the pace of your thinking. It makes you think harder and deeper about your experience. Not easy to be your own teacher because we hurry on. But sitting down and writing something, if you like a diary, helps you to learn. It's a challenge, describing the vocabulary to make sense of the world about you. The 800-calorie muffin, for example. Sometimes there's a tension between making sense or interpretation of these new experiences and what you already know. It can be uncomfortable. I certainly have been in situations where I think, oh, I've done it again, and I know exactly what's going to happen. I haven't learnt. I'm sure that's happened to you as well. But through carefully sitting down, you can anticipate and you can learn. Building and deciding what to do next. You are learning, and you're learning from the inside. You are self-teaching. One of the things that we have to be careful about, and I think reflection can help us here, is to avoid what we might call snowball thinking. And that's going over things again and again and making yourself feel increasingly demotivated or depressed. Write it down. Analyze it. Consider why you're feeling demotivated. Consider why you're depressed. Consider these things and make a change. We're all capable of learning. But just to let you know, this is the Yerkes-Dodson law. Now you'll have come across this already because it's a very simple little graph. When you are highly aroused, performance begins to go up. But there comes a point where the level of arousal begins to actually affect your performance. You cannot sustain it, or it becomes more than you can possibly bear. So what you want is to have a little bit of arousal, a little bit of concern, but you do not want to have too much. And often the part that is useful to reflect on is, at what point am I operating at high performance, and at what point does the performance begin to fall off? Reflecting about that is very interesting. So, we must analyze the incident. What would happen if it had gone differently? Why? The dilemma identification. Why do I think that? That's the personal theory. And then challenge yourself. Challenge whether or not you are making sense of it. Or in fact, are you interpreting it in a way that does not make sense? What are your thinking? What are your thoughts? Develop a habit of taking an incident and thinking about it, learning each week. Develop a vocabulary to describe and make sense of the world about you. And there is often a tension between making sense of what you already know and your new experiences. And this is normal, and this helps to drive forward your learning, just like when you were a student. There are models to help you do this, to help you structure your reflection. This is the Gibbs model, and this is the one we use at Plymouth. We ask the students to describe the experience, what happened. Then we ask them, what were you thinking and feeling at the time? Because often those situations where we're really quite stressed are often the situations in which we do a great deal of thinking and making sense of the world. But equally well, it could have gone really, really well, and you're feeling euphoric. Why? How can you make that feeling happen again? Then you need to evaluate it. What was good and what was bad about the experience. And then you need to make sense of it. Have I met that before? Is this new? What did I do before? How can I make sense of it? And I call this drawing on your vocabulary. Some of us have no vocabulary to describe things, and others of us in certain situations have many experiences and a great deal of vocabulary to describe it. So I always think of my vocabulary. What do I know? How can I explain this to myself? And the chances are you can explain it, but in the heat of the moment, it went out of your head. But writing it down and analysing it helps you to learn more from your experiences. What else could you have done? How could you have handled it differently? And if it happens again, what would you do? And of course, it probably will happen again, in which case you can describe the new experience because you will have reacted differently to it this time. Describe, consider, analyse, and plan for next time. And this is called reflection on action, looking at an event and reflecting on it. What have I learned? There are other models of reflection, and these are some of them. Some of them are hierarchical, some are holistic, and the references are given in a book at the end of this presentation. Have a look at it. Right. Through reflection, we can ask the following. How has this instance changed how I behave and who I am? What will I do differently next time? And how will I record this learning? Because actually what we're recording is lifelong learning. And of course the Diets Network has just produced a toolkit to help you think about lifelong learning, and reflection is central to that toolkit. Reflective practice then can be summarized in this way. It's the ability to modify your practice in the face of complex and changing situations. Often we reflect in action, so that as the experience presents itself, we begin to change the way we're interpreting it. We begin to draw on our vocabulary, we begin to draw on our experience, and we then interpret it and we respond in a different way. Your teaching and your practice becomes more evidence-based. Have you ever considered that? As you learn more, you build up your own evidence of the most effective ways of operating in that swampy lowland, in that area where there's no books and no papers to help you. You build up your experience as a practitioner or as a teacher. And your own students will look at you and say, wow, how in the world did my teacher manage to do a whole presentation without writing anything down? It's because you have that experience and that learning through constant reflection. I was recently in, where was I? I was in Vienna, and I said to the students, isn't it marvelous that we are able to learn from our experience how to drive a car, how to negotiate traffic lights, and so forth. And I said to them also that there are these messes which you will learn how to cope with when you're out there in the big wide world, because through practice, through reflection, you will build up your knowledge bank and your evidence base for how you know you're going to be a successful practitioner. Who creates the knowledge? You do. How is this knowledge created? Through reflection. And how do we test out our knowledge? By going through that analytical and evaluation process to see what we have learned and then to consider how it's going to be applied. Aha! The light bulb moment. Reflective practice will fulfill its potential to help us make sense of the uncertainty in our workplaces and offer us the courage to work competently and ethically at the edge of order and chaos. I think that is really an amazing outcome if you take this whole way of reflection, thinking carefully, analyzing carefully, and changing what you do, changing it to make sense of the world, and changing it to make life more successful, both for you as a practitioner and as a person. I see we've lost Agneta, who had to board a flight. She's going to listen to the end later, which is wonderful. I'm just going to go to the last slide, which are some of the references for what we've been talking about. And I'm absolutely delighted. I'll go back to the slide just before and invite you to ask some questions or make some comments on this whole process of reflective learning. Reflection to help you in your professional classroom to be your own teacher and to continually improve in a systematic and analytical way rather than repeating mistakes or the same experience and not growing. So thank you. Let's see if there are any comments. Oh, a certificate of attendance is now available to download. Select the file and the option. You can save this file to your computer, print it out, and fill in your name. How wonderful. Of course, I have no idea if you've learnt anything. The only person who knows if you've learnt anything and what you've learnt is yourself. So you might like to try out one of those reflective processes. Michelle is still typing. One of the interesting things is, oh, you're very welcome, Anna Isabel. Do you have any comments? It's been wonderful. Oh, well, how kind. Any comments, anyone? I'm wondering, really, I see we have a number of teachers here with us. For example, Simon, Bernadette. I wonder whether or not you teach reflection in your class. Anna Isabel has a question. Anna, because when we did a survey, we found that only 50% of universities, higher education institutions in Europe actually taught reflection. And yet it is so important for students to understand it. So I'd be interested to know how many actually teach this process of reflection. Okay, all right, it's been wonderful. Yes, but comments about, yes. Do you encourage people to share their reflective learning? Absolutely. One of the things that I do when I'm doing my presentations is I actually ask everyone to write down one thing that they've learnt from the presentation. You could do that yourselves now, actually. What have you picked up? What have you learnt from this presentation? And then we go round the classroom and we share it in the classroom. And that is really very useful because students hear that they often have learnt exactly the same thing as somebody else, but often they hear other things that have been learnt. And that's really interesting because what that says to me is that they are making different connections depending on their vocabulary, depending on what they already know. You make different connections, which of course is why everybody learns differently. I think reflection is really necessary, but I don't have the doubt, how can I know when I'm wrong or right? But you don't know. What you do know is that you've learnt. And sometimes what you've learnt can be useful to you next time you meet the situation. And sometimes what you've learnt is not going to be helpful to you until maybe a year or two later. But you are always learning. So how do I know when I'm right or wrong? You don't. You just know that you've learned. But the most important thing is that if you have reflected and you meet that situation again, what happens to how you meet that and deal with the situation? I don't know if you're like me, but I often find I get into a situation which I've met before, and I obviously have not learnt a thing because I still make the same mistake. So I really do need to sit down more and reflect. Sometimes it's useful to do that with a partner. Sometimes it's very useful because they can ask you questions that you might not ask yourself, help you with the analysis and the evaluation. Now it looks like Simon is writing, but we haven't seen anything Simon is writing. Simon, are you actually writing something? First of all, thank you. Unfortunately, we are not teaching reflective learning. We should be more aware of it because of its effectiveness. Absolutely correct, Simon, and please use the presentation that is on the website if you would like to, because that might be a good way of beginning to introduce the subject. It really is a wonderful tool. And I think the other thing that is very interesting about this whole process of reflection is the reflection in action, where it happens really very quickly, where you may find yourself meeting someone and evaluating the situation and thinking, do I do this or do I do this? And in that process of evaluation, you're drawing on your evidence, the evidence that in this situation this would work, or in this situation this would not work. And that reflection in action is something which goes on, which you can be conscious of, so that you can try and draw on the best evidence to make the situation effective. And that really is a very interesting process. Most students do not get to that process until after they've qualified. But we ask them to write essays, an essay about reflection. We get them to take an area to reflect on and to write us an essay about it, because it's such an important thing to be able to do. Okay. Michelle, have we used up our time? Are there any other questions out there that people would like to to ask. Michelle is now typing. It's been delightful being able to share this with you. I have a real interest in this, and I have an interest in it because what I have learned is that you can change the complete way you approach situations, the complete way that you think about things, just through asking yourself, why did I do it that way? Why did I take the time or not take the time? You can also look at your partner or your fiance, and you can realize that they analyze situations in completely different ways to the way you do it. And that's fascinating. Some of them like really to get lots and lots of experiences, but then decide not to think about them. Other people don't really like to have a lot of new experiences, but like to think deeply about them. And that's really interesting to see how people, if you like, solve life experiences and life problems. And being an observer of your patients, of your students, whoever it might be, and entering into that process of reflection to help you understand the situation is really very, very interesting. In my class in Vienna, I stopped. I said to the class, I can tell class that you are no longer concentrating on what I'm saying. So we finished early. And I did that through a process of reflection on how I was receiving information, what I knew from past experiences, and it was time to go. So I think it's time to go now. I think we've covered a lot of information. And I think, yes, Michelle is saying, I think it would be interesting to review your reflective learning over time to see how you've grown. Absolutely, Michelle. I think that kind of reflection is amazing. Absolutely amazing. So thank you for staying with us. Think about reflection. Think about the analysis. Have a look at some of the references. And good luck as reflective practitioners. Thank you. Bye-bye.